Yes, so today I'm going to talk to you about my project that I call Growing Old in an Adopted Land. It explores the aging experiences of migrant communities in New Zealand. This is where I live. I'm originally from Hungary, but I've lived in New Zealand for over 12 years now. And one of the reasons I do this project, often people ask me, why are you studying aging and migration? And I always tell people it's because I want to know about my own future. I want to know what it means to live a life as an immigrant and what it means to grow old in a country that's not where you kind of grew up. The other reason I'm doing this research is because I did my PhD in cross-cultural psychology, specifically looking at adult migrants and their acculturation experiences, how they develop an immigrant identity. And I worked with Professor Colleen Ward. She was my supervisor at Victoria University of Wellington. So some of you working in that area or exploring acculturation research would be familiar with her name. And when I finished my PhD, I was looking for a job and I got this postdoctoral fellowship in the area of aging. And at that time, I didn't know anything about aging. I got the job because I had the analytic skills to do the work, but I didn't know anything about the topic. But as I started to work in this field, I realized that there was very little scholarship on aging and migration. There was a lot of work coming out from different countries talking about what it's like to age in North America, what it's like to age in Japan, what it's like to age in China. So there are all these really big longitudinal studies all around the world. There's one in China, the China Longitudinal Study of Aging. But there was very little work around migration and aging. So what does it mean to age at the intersection of cultures? So I started to develop this program of research, and I was lucky enough to get some funding in 2020 to do this work for 5 years. So aging and migration are demographic challenges, but they are not commonly studied together, although they are intersecting areas. If we look at worldwide statistics, we can see that there is a larger proportion of aging migrants than the proportion of older adults in native populations. So if you look at this figure here, you can see that approximately 9% of the world's population is age 65 plus. And if you look at this pie chart next to it, we can see that 12% of the migrant population are 65 years or older. So that, what does that mean? It means that we have kind of a similar percentages, but if anything, more migrants are in that kind of older age group. So why is it particularly relevant to my context, New Zealand? So we can see Oceania, so that incorporates Australia, New Zealand, and the islands. Oceania has the largest proportion of older migrants in the world and has seen the largest increase in the number of older migrants over time. In New Zealand specifically, according to the latest census, 27%, that is 1 in 4 people, older people, were born overseas. And this number is expected to grow. I couldn't really find statistics for China specifically, but that you can see Asia there, which is obviously huge, and the figure there is 8%. But as our populations are growing and countries are becoming more and more diverse, this is becoming, I guess, a challenge or a significant phenomenon across countries. So what is special about how migrants age? That's a question I often get from people. They are asking me, okay, I understand you're looking at migrants and aging, but what is so special about their aging experiences? Is it different, or why do we have to specifically look at this topic? And there are kind of 3 main points I want to talk about today. The first one is what we call the migrant paradox or the healthy immigrant effect. It is widely documented that despite their lower socioeconomic status and experiences of culture barriers, first-generation immigrants often report better health and well-being than their native peers. And this is a phenomenon that has become known as the healthy immigrant effect or the migrant paradox. And this counterintuitive effect is thought to be driven by a combination of factors. One is self-selection into migration, so people who are generally healthier and in better well-being are more likely to decide to immigrate. So people who are sick or unwell, they are more likely to stay home. But also there are more macro level factors contributing to this phenomenon, particularly migration policies. In a lot of countries around the world, there are very stringent health requirements for migration, including New Zealand. So when I immigrated to New Zealand, I had to meet very specific health requirements. And if someone is not in good health, they simply don't get a visa, so they don't get accepted. And it's really difficult to then gain permanent residency. So that's another factor that might contribute to this counterintuitive effect. But what's really interesting is that there's increasing evidence internationally that this health advantage diminishes as people age. And older migrants, by later life, immigrants often arrive at old age in poorer health than their age-related native peers. So they have more disabilities, poorer mental health, more chronic conditions, general greater morbidity, and sometimes even early mortality. So what's going on here? We have these people who arrive to a country, they are in really good health, right? They are doing really well. And then over time, as they age in the country, their health starts to decrease. It diminishes over time. And by the age of 65, they are in much poorer health than the native population. So what does that mean? It means that something happens to them over time. These people have experiences that put them on a more vulnerable health trajectory. So that's one of the things I'm really interested in exploring. What are those experiences that make people vulnerable in terms of their aging? But also, can we identify factors that are protective, that promote resilience as migrants age? The second point or second theory that I use to frame my research is called the accumulation of advantage or disadvantage theory. It's a life course theory of aging that focuses on how people's experiences accumulate over time. So we don't just arrive at old age and suddenly become sick or have difficulties. We carry our life experiences with us. And the accumulation of disadvantage theory posits that there are systemic differences between individuals and groups in society in terms of their access to resources. And these differences widen with the passage of time. So we know that there are numerous risk factors associated with the migrant experience. So these are challenges that arise from acculturation, such as learning a new language, navigating cross-cultural differences and values, norms, and behaviors, social isolation, experiences of discrimination. And when people are exposed to these experiences over and over again, repeatedly across their life course, this will increase their vulnerability in terms of their health. And it puts migrants on a more negative health trajectory. And finally, we know that aging is culturally mediated. how we understand what it means to age well, or what it means to age successfully, or what healthy aging looks like, is influenced by our cultural values. So in Western individualistic cultures, people often value independence and autonomy. There's this idea that older people should be living alone, independently. They shouldn't be a burden on society and their families. In other cultures, more collectivistic cultures, and I assume China is similar to that, there is this idea that older people are a valued member of society. They should be respected, they should be looked after. There's a strong value of filial piety. So a very different understanding of what it means to age well. It's more about being a valued member of the community. It's about maintaining cultural generativity, passing on knowledge, valuing wisdom, having respect. So a very different way of thinking about aging, right? So people not only value different ways of growing old, they also realize their health and well-being very differently in different cultures. So if we think about migrants, the challenge here is that they often have to navigate two different sets of cultural expectations. So like in the New Zealand context, which is arguably quite kind of Western and individualistic, a lot of migrant groups have to navigate those sorts of expectations around what it means to age well, but also then they have their own cultural expectations around what they imagine, for their own like older adulthood and how they want to grow old and live their lives. So that challenge is kind of balancing those cultural expectations and navigating that as they grow older. Okay, so these are kind of three main theoretical frameworks that I use to frame my research. And my research program centers around three interconnected themes. The first theme explores the meanings migrants associate with aging well. The second theme focuses on issues related to transnational belonging, loss, meaning of place, particularly aging in place, when home means two different countries. And the third theme, which I call Growing Old Together, seeks to understand how culturally mixed couples navigate aging and the extent to which intercultural marriages create unique pathways to aging well across the lifespan. At the heart of my research program is a cohort study that includes both prospective and retrospective data collection and a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods. So I conduct focus group interviews. I do life history interviews with older migrants and dyadic interviews with couples, culturally mixed couples. I also have a longitudinal survey data that I administer to migrants aged 30 and over, looking at how kind of tracking people over time, understanding how they experience life as they grow older in New Zealand. So we just started the longitudinal data collection last year. So it's not very long yet, but the idea is that over time, it will turn into a long-term longitudinal study of aging among migrant communities. So today, I'm going to talk to you about my focus group study. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the life course history interviews, and I will also give you a sneak peek into the survey data. So a little bit of everything. I'm not going to talk about the direct interviews because we're just starting that data collection, so I don't have much to report on yet. So in terms of the focus group study, our main question was, what does it mean to age well for migrants, and how do they achieve it? As I mentioned, we know that aging is culturally mediated. Beliefs about what it means to age well vary across cultures and are strongly determined by the values individuals and communities hold. And as I mentioned, this can put migrants in a difficult position because they live at the intersection of cultures and they have to negotiate demands and expectations of at least two cultures, but sometimes more. So what we did was we approached different communities in New Zealand, the Chinese community, the Indian community, Sri Lankans, Samoans, South Africans, and British migrants. So these are the biggest migrant communities in New Zealand, with the largest numbers, and particularly in that older demographic. I also wanted to include a wide range of different migrant groups that differ in terms of culture distance, so how similar their culture background is to the majority New Zealand culture. So British is very similar to the mainstream New Zealand culture, as New Zealand is a settler colonial society. And then we have a really strong influence from the Pacific, so that's why I included Samoan migrants. And then we have actually a really long history of Chinese migration in New Zealand that started in the 1800s. And then more recently, Indian, Sri Lankan, and South African migrants. So we completed 17 focus groups. Almost 80 participants have contributed from these communities. We tried to have focus group discussions with communities both in big cities like Auckland and Wellington, which are the bigger cities in the North Island of New Zealand, but also more regional areas, smaller rural areas, because I wanted to see what it means to be an older person when you live more like regionally or rurally, not in an urban center. And I guess what's really important is that every focus group included members, 5, 6, 7 people from the same ethnic group. So like I would have a focus group with Sri Lankans, 3 to 6 Sri Lankan older adults, or 3 to 6 Chinese older adults from the community in one group. And we conducted the interviews sometimes in English, but also we offered it in the native language of our participants. So all the Chinese groups were in Mandarin or Cantonese. The Samoan groups were in Samoan language, and then offered the Sri Lankan interviews in Sinhalese, but actually they often chose English in those communities. Yeah. And we conducted thematic analysis on the data to answer our questions about what aging well means to older migrants. And these are the 4 overarching themes that were identified. So in today's talk, I will briefly discuss the themes maintaining health and realizing capabilities first, then provide a bit more information about the other 2 themes, cultivating belonging and managing culture expectations. Unsurprisingly, health and well-being were identified as the foundation of aging well in all groups. People agreed you have to have good health and good well-being to age well. However, there were very marked differences across groups in terms of how people identified or defined health and well-being, whether it was understood as individual functioning or the wellness and well-being of the community or the collective. So here you can see for the first quote is from a participant from a British group who said, "I think the most important thing is keeping healthy. You have nothing without your health." And then the next participant from South Africa, she specifically talked about the importance of mental health. And then Lee from China said, "It's the most important thing is your social well-being, having friends and good relationships." So people talked about health, not just in terms of physical health, but more broadly in terms of mental and social well-being. Many participants talked about well-being at the family level, independent of their own physical and mental functioning. Some groups reflected on how their happiness was tied to the family system. So older people talked about their health as, if my children are healthy, if my grandchildren are healthy, if they are having a good life, that means I'm having a good life as well. And on the contrary as well, if their children and grandchildren had challenges, they experience that as their own challenges. So here we have a quote from Dirk, who talked about how his children's challenges became his own challenges, and then said, I think that's one of the biggest things that takes the joy away from us elderly people. So that was a really interesting difference or notion of family well-being. And similarly, there were clear distinctions between culture groups regarding defining health as a holistic concept that incorporated spirituality and social well-being, or simply describing it as physical and mental functioning. So particularly this quote from one of the participants in the Sri Lankan community emphasizes that to age well, these different aspects of life have to be in balance. So as she explained it, the social, the physical, and the spiritual should be in balance. And once that is in balance, you are living well in any place. So that was really specific for the Sri Lankan and Indian participants. The Chinese participants also talked about this balance, whereas British people didn't. They just talked about, physical, mental. So it's a very kind of different way of thinking about what health means and how you realize your health and well-being. The next major theme was about capability. People talked about the importance of being able to live according to valued goals and having freedom to make choices. And importantly, they didn't kind of put necessarily a label to what it was. They said just whatever you value. And so this person, Johanna, explained that here I am free. I have my own house. I can go and walk. I never feel threatened. So to me, healthy aging is more than mobility, being able to do what I want to do. So my participants identified environmental support and social position as critical factors influencing whether migrants can realize their capabilities. So enabling environments include things like having your own home, living in a safe and socially connected neighborhood, and a welfare system that provides the necessary support for people to thrive, as highlighted by this quote from Martha, who said, to me, aging well means living in the right place, and the right place for aging, the best place that I know of is here, because there are so many free things to do, to enjoy your life, and there's an excellent community spirit, good networking, but even with a number of free things available to make aging well possible, you still need money. So importantly, there was this shared recognition across communities and groups that you need financial security to age well. There were, however, differences across communities in terms of who they thought was responsible for financial security, whether they thought it was their individual responsibility to save for retirement, or whether the government should provide a welfare system that looks after older people. Also, there were differences in terms of how much emphasis they put on financial support or finances. In some communities, it was really important. In others, there was a recognition that it's important to have resources, but actually it doesn't necessarily give you quality of life. So Rui said, if you have money but no quality of life, that is no use. So, and then belonging was identified as a key component of aging well as a migrant, but experience of belonging were strongly patterned by culture. One of the most striking findings to me was that only British migrants saw themselves as New Zealanders. They identified very strongly as New Zealanders, and they actually rejected the migrant label. And this is illustrated by this quote from Anne-Marie, who said, "Oh, we've all talked as British immigrants, or if you use the word immigrants, whether we are or not." So they generally talked about being a New Zealander as a right, as opposed to something that they earn. And actually, there was very little acknowledgement of having a privileged position as an English-speaking migrant from the UK. The participants talked about a lot of barriers to belonging, one of which was the difficulty of developing meaningful social connections with New Zealanders. It was mentioned as a common challenge, creating a barrier to a sense of belonging. So here we have Becky talk about her experience, aging alone, unable to make long-lasting connections. And importantly, she blames herself for her social exclusion, seeing it as her individual failure. She says, "I scare people off." So that I like to use this quote because Becky was from the UK. So just showing that there were so many differences even within communities. So when I talk about my findings, it doesn't mean that every single person from that community has that experience. We're looking at kind of patterns of experiences. Discrimination was another commonly discussed factor, just like Becky taking kind of the blame for her isolation. Many migrants frame discrimination as kind of an individual responsibility. They talked about how it's just something that you have to accept. It's part of being a migrant, that life is just a little bit harder for you. You have to, as Anura says from Sri Lanka, you just have to work harder. This is how it is for immigrants. So there was this really interesting kind of feeling that there's not much you can do about it. You just kind of put up with it, and then you work harder and hoping that you will have a better life. So that was a really interesting finding, and I could go on and on about it. But generally, there was this is kind of feeling among migrants, if you do the right things, then you won't be discriminated against. And if you're a good migrant, then you will have a good life, which is an interesting way of thinking about discrimination. So parallel to this need or desire for belonging, people highlighted the important role of cultural connectedness. Being embedded in one's culture contributes to aging well. And this includes maintaining cultural traditions, practices, spirituality, celebrating cultural events, being part of the wider community. So here, Joshil from the Indian community explains the role of cultural connectedness in both maintaining and developing a sense of belonging. So he says, you maintain your culture all the way. You don't have to change it because you come to New Zealand. You don't have to overnight become a New Zealander. You still have to retain your culture, whatever you're normally doing, but then at the same time, accept what's coming in, right? So you become a richer person. So essentially what Joshil describes here is what we call integration in acculturation research, when people both maintain their heritage culture while also adopt and integrate features of the dominant culture into their life and identity. Importantly, in order to cultivate this culture belonging, migrants should be afforded access to their own culture. Not being able to access their own culture has been highlighted as a significant barrier to aging well. So the first quote by Faye provides an example for this. So she says, it's important to have more opportunities to communicate and participate in activities. It's like for Tai Chi. Multicultural Council thought of this and supported us for a 10-week program for us to learn Tai Chi with teacher Rui. We don't know if there will be more after these 10 weeks. So essentially, she explained that there was this really good community initiative where she lives. She lives quite rurally in a really small town in regional New Zealand, where the city decided that they will offer Tai Chi to the Chinese community, and they had that, and it had an amazing influence on their community because they could come together, they could speak in Chinese, do Tai Chi. It was good for their physical health, it was good for their culture connectedness. They connected with their teacher, Rui, and so it was a really positive experience. But then it stopped. It was only for 10 weeks. And suddenly it was over, and there was no assurance that they will continue supporting this initiative. So it really shows the importance of enabling people to access their own culture. And if there's a lack of continuity, it makes it really challenging to build long-lasting resilience within a culture community. And another really commonly discussed experience was in the Indian, Sri Lankan, Samoan, and Chinese communities was the lack of culturally appropriate residential care. So a lot of older migrants worry about that very late stage of life when they might have to go into a residential care home. And particularly in the New Zealand context, there's really good health care. So they always say, I'm not worried about my physical health being taken care of. I know that there are some really good facilities, but they are not always culturally sensitive or appropriate. And people talk about the importance of having those cultural needs taken care of, especially at that very late stage of life. So here, Padma from the Indian community said, your physical comforts can be taken care of, but that feeling of being with people who understand you, whether you speak the language or whether you may speak English, how to create an environment where everyone's culture is valued. There are enough immigrant people who are having to use these facilities, and it's tough when the food is oriented to one culture. It's tough when the language is not your number one language. It's tough when the things you want to talk about, the other people have no experience of. And this was a really important kind of source of anxiety for older migrants to kind of arrive to that very final kind of stage of life and going into this facility and having to start over again. They talked about that stress that you live your life, and everywhere you go, it's always like adapting and adjusting. It's at school, at work, with your children. And then you get to an age where it's just you can't do it anymore. You don't want to start over again and then kind of go through that stress of acculturating and adapting to this new environment again. So that was a really important finding, that really for migrant communities to age well, it's really important that they have access to their culture and they have access to it across different areas of life, and particularly in institutional contexts as well. And finally, my participants talked about managing cultural expectation as a key component of aging well as a migrant. And they talked about this as kind of constantly walking a tightrope, navigating expectations from two or more cultures simultaneously, while also managing the stressors of being a migrant and just being a person. There's a lot of daily stress for people in general. So aging well for them was about learning to negotiate these expectations skillfully and sustainably throughout the life course. So for example, the South African community, they often talked about feeling of being pulled from two directions. On one hand, they found that New Zealanders often had kind of negative stereotypes about South Africans. But on the other, there was this expectations that South Africans would just fit in really easily. So here Amanda says, they see European South Africans. We look exactly the same as your Pākehā. Pākehā means European, so European New Zealander, until we open our mouths. And even though not everybody picks up my accent and is being South African, some do, some don't, but they expect us to think the same and to be the same, and it's a bit of a shock. And as she continues, she identifies the life course impact of these experiences and how people arrive at old age. She says, I think it's made me a little bit more varied. In some ways, most of my friends are immigrants. They are not all South African, but a lot of them are. Then we have Florence, another participant in the group, who kind of reinforces this message, saying, it's not aging, but it is part of our experience. I think what we are bringing into our aging, is that experience. So what they are talking about is that accumulation of advantage, disadvantage idea that I introduced at the beginning, that they are saying, we've had these experiences throughout our life course, and we kind of arrived to old age with a little bit of, we are being a bit cautious. And all my friends are immigrants because I had these sort of experiences, and I couldn't really develop many connections with other New Zealanders. So they are really kind of recognizing the life course impact and the long lasting effect of these experiences. So what we found in this focus group study was that sense of belonging is a universal need. It shapes what aging well looks for migrants and whether they can achieve living a good life. We also found that national belonging was not equally afforded to all migrant groups. Navigating discrimination and managing contradictory expectations throughout the life course can have a negative impact on how well migrants age. Culture connectedness is a protective factor that facilitates belonging and aging well. However, cultural connectedness can only be achieved if people have access to their culture, both in private and public domains of life. And for migrants, maintaining health or aging well is more than just maintaining health. It's remaining independent or having strong family ties or community involvement. It really lies in the ability to negotiate demands and expectations of multiple cultures effectively. So the next study I want to talk about is my life course history interviews. So another kind of project that I did was talking to older migrants about their life histories. So I invite them for an interview, and essentially I tell them, you can talk to me for a couple of hours, tell me about your life. You decide what you want to share. I'm not going to tell you what to say. Just tell me about your life. And it's a really fun way of interviewing people. That you give a lot of control and power to your participants because they can guide the interview and tell you anything that they want. And it's a real privilege to hear people's stories, but it takes a long time. So there were times when I was sitting with someone for hours and they had lots to say about their life. And it generates a lot of rich data. And one of the things that I was interested in, how people talk about how does New Zealand become someone's home? How do people develop attachment to a place over the life course? So I was looking at their life history interviews and how they talked about this. So a little bit about place attachment. So we know that migration involves the uprooting of one's life, disrupting the bonds migrants have with people and places that make a home. And simultaneously, migrants are faced with the task of creating new bonds and establishing a home in a new environment. In addition, as we grow older, we have to make a decision about where we want to live out the rest of our lives. And this makes places very salient in our life stories. So a lot of older people I talk to, they talk about this kind of decision about, should I stay or should I go back to my country of origin? There's this idea about having a full circle, right? Going back to your roots. So it's kind of a really important decision as people get older. Not so much when we are younger, we don't really think about it, but as we are kind of approaching that later stage of life, places become really important. So there's this concept in psychology and also human geography called place attachment. It has two components, place dependence and place identity. So place dependence refers to the bonds that we form with a place that confer a sense of participation, purpose, self-fulfillment. So these bonds provide us with safety, ability to satisfy our goals and needs. And then we have place identity. These are the bonds that we form with a place that provide us with a sense of belonging or self-esteem. It defines who we are and our identities. And together they create place attachment. And kind of if you want to define place attachment, it's an effective bond to a place, a sense of comfort, safety, belonging, connection, pride, familiarity, provides us with a sense of satisfaction, or that kind of feelings of home. If you ever have that, when you go to a place, I don't know if some of you who might not be from Benja, if you go home to visit your families and then you see the landscapes and then you suddenly have this feeling, or the food that you eat, it just gives you that sense of home. So that's kind of the attachment we make to places, and it gives us this like really strong emotion. So I have that when I go home to visit my family in Hungary, and as I'm like traveling towards my parents' town and I start to see the landscapes, and I have those feelings that like, I don't know, that kind of goosebumps. So it really gives you that kind of emotional attachment. So I was really interested to see, how do people develop that in a new place? And what happens to your attachments to the other place back home? And I did this from a life course perspective because I think attaching ourselves to places is a process that continues across the life course. It's informed by past experiences, and at times it can kind of extend beyond even our own existence. It can extend to future generations. Like we might have attachments to places that come from not our own experiences, but maybe from stories of our grandparents or our parents. And also developing place attachment is not simply just something that you attach yourself to a place at one point in time, but it's something that is always actively happening. You can form new attachments, and attachments can be broken, they can change, they can change in terms of the emotions that you attach to a place over time as well. And we can have a multiplicity of attachments to places. So because of that, we know that place attachments are temporal, so they are influenced by past experiences and extend into the future. They are flexible and they are dimensional. So what we did, we used life course history interviews, and particularly narrative interviewing. So narrative interviewing is a very specific, or narrative analysis, I should say, is a very specific way of analyzing data. We are looking for stories that people tell about their experiences, and not just what stories people tell, but how they tell their stories, how they organize their life histories. And what stories people choose is really important, because we tell our stories in specific ways, and also we don't tell our stories the same way every time. So when I talk to someone, like if I talk to Alex about something, I will say my story in a very different way compared to if I talk to Ashley, for example. And maybe because we are both women, so I'm going to talk about maybe other aspects of my life. And then with Alex, we are both professors, so I'm just going to say it in a very different way. So we are constructing our life stories every day, and then we are reconstructing it and reconstructing it. So it's really important how we tell stories and how we structure it. So with narrative methodology, we can actually pay really close attention to the structure of storytelling. So it's very different to like thematic analysis, which is just I'm drawing out themes. I'm developing kind of particular themes or content that people talked about. With narratives, the structure becomes really, really important. Yeah, so we talked to a lot of people. We did 40 of these interviews, each taking around 2 hours. So that gave us a lot of data. But in this particular analysis, I focused on 10 people, 10 narratives that were that had really strong narratives of place attachment. And I can't really go through all 10 of them because that would take forever. But I published this in the paper, so I can send Alex the paper and you can read it if you want. But I'm going to talk about two particular people, the story of Francesca and the story of Robert. So this is just a little overview of all of the 10 participants and what sort of narratives they talked about. And what we did as we analyzed their narratives, we looked at their place attachment pre-migration, so before they moved to New Zealand, then how they developed place dependence, which is that kind of idea that this place fulfills my needs, and then place identity, which is more of that kind of affective bond. And then these are the kind of different narratives that we identified at each stage of the life course. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Robert, Jessica, specifically. So we're going to start with Robert. So Robert's story was really interesting. He felt a very strong emotional connection to Britain, his homeland, and he felt like it was part of his identity. And this place offered him a lot of functional benefits and a lot of identity. But he decided to immigrate to New Zealand, not because it was his decision, it was driven by his dad's decision. And although he was an adult, he was 18 years old at the time, he was just not really prepared to live alone in Britain. So his dad decided to uproot the family, move everyone to New Zealand. And it was a really hard thing for Robert. He talks about loving England during that time. He talks about the freewheeling 60s, loving the culture, Beatlemania. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all, and optimism that it brought. But it was a forced migration for him. It wasn't his own decision, and that was really hard. He says, it seems a terrible thing to be leaving, really, to be honest. So this describes a pattern in which a lot of the time migration decisions are actually determined by men's pursuits of economic and educational prospects. So we see in the literature, they often talk about the trailing spouse. So it's women who follow their husbands because they get a good job overseas in another country. So that's kind of how often people migrate, not because they want to go, but because someone else in the family made the decision for them. And then if we look at his place dependence post-migration, it's clear that life was good. He talks about a lot of things that living in New Zealand enabled him to do. He talks about it was a warm, receptive sort of country. We were very well looked after. I'm the perfect Mr. Suburbanite. We live perfectly happily in a suburban dwelling that we have made our own. So he talks about having everything in life that he needs. He has a house, he has safety, He got good education. He eventually became a lawyer. Everyone was kind and warm. He was looked after very well. It was a very kind of warm, receptive country. But he talks about how even though it fulfilled all his needs, it didn't feel like home still. So at the beginning of this quote, he says, there's this song we used to sing, LA is fine, but it ain't home. New York's home, but it ain't mine anymore. So New Zealand was not fine. I was starting to appreciate it, though it wasn't my home. And that's really important with place dependence. That's what we see a lot of the time with migrants, that a place can give you a lot of benefits. It can fulfill all your kind of functional needs. It doesn't make it your home necessarily. That affective component is often missing. And then over time, as he spent more and more time aging in New Zealand, what happens is that he loses his place identity to both his country of origin, and also he struggles to develop an identity to New Zealand. He says, as the years go by, my understanding of New Zealand slowly gets better, but I always feel like an outsider. I spent 3 months in England, and that gave me kind of an understanding of how the UK had changed by that stage. I couldn't relate to what was happening in Britain. I'm glad we came to New Zealand. I would have in some ways hated to go through the Thatcher years in Britain. So essentially what he talks about it is over time, he lost his connection to England. So that place identity was no longer there, but he was at the same time not really able to develop that identity, a connection to New Zealand. And specifically, he told a very interesting story about an error that happened when he applied for citizenship. So he applied for citizenship and he got his certificate and he was really excited. He put it in a frame, he put it on the wall. He was really proud to become a New Zealand citizen. And then 3 weeks later, he got a letter from the ministry and they said, oh, we made a mistake. It's a different person. Could you please give your citizenship back? And he talks about this experience as like a real important turning point that then prevented him from developing this attachment to New Zealand, because it just reinforced his sense of being an outsider. And another important story in his life that became a lifelong barrier to becoming attached to New Zealand is his father's unbelievable sort of hatred of the place. So he talks about how his father forced him to move to New Zealand. And then when they arrived, his dad actually hated the place throughout his entire life. So it's a really kind of important narrative or story for Robert, because he said, I always felt that if I ever tried to settle down here, that was being disloyal to him. So his father hated the place, so he felt like he couldn't love it either because he didn't want to be disloyal to his family. So he distanced himself from developing a New Zealand identity because he didn't want his relationship with his father to deteriorate, but also distanced himself from his British identity because his values did not align with kind of Britain anymore. It didn't feel like home. It was a different place. So what happened is that he talks about being trapped in the condition of being a foot in either camp and not totally happy about either. So again, if we go back to acculturation theory, this is what we kind of call marginalization. Someone who doesn't belong anywhere. They are kind of in between. They are not strongly attached to their culture of origin, but they are not strongly attached to the new culture either. So that was Robert. Quite a sad story in a way. But then we have Francesca, the total opposite. So Francesca talked about the reason why she immigrated. She had a a good relationship with her country of origin, which is Portugal. But she talked about the place not really meeting her needs and goals. And particularly, she talked about having limited opportunities, especially for people like her in her home country. So she says, I met my African husband, and this was still thinking, I'll stay in Portugal, stay in Europe. But in the end, we decided it would be nice to live together. And if we're going to live together, because he's African, his country was out of the question. So we looked at the globe and we thought, where can we go? What country has the values that we have? Portugal remained a place with limited opportunities. So although Francesca was strongly attached to Portugal and described it as being part of her soul, because she had an African husband, it meant that she just couldn't start a life with her husband in Portugal. So they needed to find a different place, a place that would enable them to live a life without judgment. So in contrast to Robert, place dependence for Francesca was cultivated immediately. She stated that she has always been very grateful to New Zealand. She had freedom there to live a life that she wanted. And it was kind of an immediate fulfillment of goals that she couldn't fulfill in Portugal. She got a job, she was kind of doing really well. And then Francesca talks about keeping her Portuguese identity alive and around me all the time. She uses art, music, food, celebrating traditional holidays, joining a Portuguese group. And she also imparted her passions on her children and believes that her Portuguese identity doesn't make her any less of a New Zealander. And she also makes a comparison in her narrative between the natural landscapes of her town in Portugal and the coastlines of her town in New Zealand. So that's kind of that attachment I was talking about when you see landscapes. So she says, I spend most of my time in Portugal. It's right on the coast. It's where the river meets the Atlantic Ocean. And that point where this is the westernmost point of continental Europe, I would say it's the edge. And here I stand on the edge of the south coast and you are just looking out, then there is a similarity, in a way for me helps because there is a connection. It's part of who I am, my identity. Those are the things that are hard to explain to people who aren't deeply connected to worlds. So she talks about this multiplicity of attachments that one can have despite not physically being in that place, and in the ways in which her dual identity or dual place attachment enables her to have this sort of hybrid identity or dual identification as a Portuguese New Zealander. So she feels both equally attached to both places. Right. So it's a really nice contrast to Robert. And then we have all these different other ways of attaching across the 10 stories. So I'll send you the article and you can read all the different stories. But what I kind of just wanted to give you a taster of what sort of stories people are telling and the level of detail and richness that we can get from this sort of interviewing. Yes, and there are lots of contributions from this research. Our study illustrates the value of examining place attachments of migrants from a life course perspective. It shows how historical times are intertwined with human lives, the kind of context of the home country fundamentally shaped people's place attachments to the new country. Timing of lives is really important. This is kind of critical life events that enable us to either form new attachments or break attachments. So critical life events include things like migration, but also things like getting married or having children or changing jobs, having significant health challenges, so critical life events that that really shape the way we experience life and how we attach to places. It's also really clear from these life history interviews that our lives are interconnected with other people. So for Robert, it was his dad's decision to move that really influenced his entire life story. For Francesca, it was the fact that he married an African man and they couldn't live together in Portugal, so that kind of started their migration story. And also we see a lot of stories around how we accumulate advantage or disadvantage over the life course. Cool. So that was the life history study, and then the last part is from our survey research. So kind of switching gears, more quantitative research now, and particularly there's this one study, quite new recent findings from our research, where we looked at how the COVID-19 pandemic changed the way migrants maintain transnational connections. So we know that transnational connections are really important for migrants in terms of their health and well-being, and particularly technology mediated contact. And we know that became quite an important focus during COVID. There were several studies showing that migrants' international communication and contact changed during the pandemic. For a lot of people, there was kind of no difficulties. It was a really instant switch, and they didn't do a lot of kind of things differently. But for other migrants, it was a struggle. And some migrants completely lost communication with friends and family overseas. A lot of research also shows that particularly international students, but many other migrant communities as well, started to use technology-mediated contact a lot, and they use it as a coping mechanism. And it had very important benefits for them. What's important, though, is that these studies focus on the immediate effects of COVID on how migrants maintain transnational connections. But we know less about how this experience continues to shape the way we maintain contact with friends and family. And we kind of like to think that COVID is over, and in a way it is, because we no longer have a pandemic, and it's not a health crisis anymore, but it's still around, and there are long-lasting implications, particularly in the context where I live in New Zealand. We currently have a cost of living crisis, so things are really expensive. We are a small island nation at the bottom of the world, super far from everywhere. We still have very limited flights, so it can be really challenging for migrants from New Zealand to travel, and flights are really, really expensive as well. So compared to what it used to be before the pandemic, flights cost 2, 3, 4 times as much. Especially, it's kind of better with like Australia and Asia, but for me to go home to Europe, it's like 3 times as expensive than before COVID. So actually, there are still a lot of long-lasting effects from the pandemic. And we were really interested to see how this kind of continues to shape the way migrants maintain transnational contact. So we collected data from around 500 migrants living in New Zealand. They were migrants from the community, and they were randomly selected. So what we did, we sent postcard invitations to people in the Wellington and Auckland regions, which are the 2 biggest cities, and invited people who were migrants to participate in this survey. So you can see that it was a kind of a community sample. The mean age was 53. People had been in New Zealand for kind of around 20 years, so well established. migrants, 50% female, most of them were partnered, quite highly educated and in paid employment. And so this is how we measured transnational connection. So first of all, we asked, has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the way you maintain contact with your friends who live outside of New Zealand? Yes, no. If yes, how has the pandemic impacted the way you maintain this contact in terms of visiting in person, calling each other, including Skype and Zoom, and communicating by email, Facebook, or other social media like WhatsApp and WeChat? And whether it has become more often, less often, or about the same. And we did exactly the same for family as well. So we have transnational contact with friends and family. And then we did a latent class analysis, which is a method where we look at groupings of responses for individuals and create different profiles or different classes of individuals. And once I show you the results, it will become much clearer. And I have lots of numbers here that are actually not very important. What's important is that we found that there are 5 different configurations or network profiles that I like to call them. Now we'll walk you through all of them. So what we found was that for most people, around 50% of migrants, nothing's changed really. So all these bars are gray. Gray means unchanged. And we have family visits, family calls, family online contact, and then same for friends, visits, calls, and online. And there was not much change. The only little thing that we see is like a little bit of decline in visiting family in person. So for half of the sample, it's just nothing's changed. Then we had around 19% of people who said that in-person visits decreased, and particularly with friends. So in this group, 100% said that I'm seeing friends much less in person. That's substantially declined. And same for family. Very significant decrease in in-person communication. Then we have this other group that said, yes, in-person visits declined. We are no longer seeing each other in person, but I increased technology-mediated contact. So we are calling each other more, we are talking on social media, we're doing WeChat, Facebook contact is high. So it's really increased all that technology mediated contact, even though there's no more in-person visits. And then there was this other group, around 9%, who said, with friends, things kind of remain the same, but with family, a large proportion of these people increased contact. And particularly, this is the only group where we see that at least some of them increased in-person visits as well. So that was quite surprising. And then we had this 5th group, which is a small proportion of the sample. But what we see here is all red, right? Like these are people who had a really high likelihood of withdrawing from social contact. So they decreased contact with friends, they decreased contact with family overseas and across all modalities. And particularly if you look at friends, it's huge. Like they just completely withdrew from contact with friends. So we have these 5 groups. So what I wanted to know is like what predicts being in these groups. So is it like women who tend to increase contact and men who withdraw, or like what are some of the kind of socio-demographic predictors of these groups? And we found nothing. Like there were a few very small differences, but we couldn't find any really significant predictors of the groups. And I don't know if it's because we don't have the right predictors, but we looked at a wide range of social demographic factors and nothing was, there were a few very small differences, but nothing really meaningful. But then we also looked at the outcomes of these profiles and how they relate to health and well-being. And that's where we see a lot of differences. And I'm going to walk you through this because this is complicated. Well, it looks complicated, but actually it's very simple. So we have the 5 groups down there on the x-axis. And then we have 3 bars. We have loneliness, blue, depression, orange, and well-being, gray. And essentially what we see here is that the 2 groups who decreased contact, either in terms of visits or all contact, they have significantly higher levels of loneliness and depression. And particularly that final group, that small group of people who withdrew, they were incredibly lonely. And they had a lot of symptoms of depression. And same with the people whose visits decreased. And then on the other side, we see that the 2 groups who increased contact, they have lower depression and loneliness, and they score much better in terms of their well-being. What's really important here is that this is cross-sectional. So we don't know what causes what. So is it that people who are lonely, they tend to withdraw, or people who withdraw become lonely? So we don't know yet. It will be a longitudinal study, so eventually we will be able to answer that question, or at least explore it a little bit more. But nonetheless, what's important here is that we have people who are vulnerable. And we know that people who decrease contact, they are at risk. Either they decrease their contact because they were already lonely, or that contact makes them lonelier and more depressed, but not regardless, we know that they are at risk. So that gives us some good focus for intervention and thinking about the importance of promoting or creating avenues for people to maintain transnational contact. So in terms of kind of take-home messages, what we see here is the pandemic continues to shape the way we maintain contact and the way we relate to transnational family and friends. It's also important that 50% of the sample didn't change, right? So that's actually a pretty high number. And then we also had both positive and negative changes. And those changes are very similar in proportion, like approximately 25% increased contact in different ways and 25% decreased contact. But those who decrease contact, they report significant vulnerabilities. Yeah, so that was kind of the taster I wanted to give you about my research project. And in terms of future avenues of future explorations, we're going to continue collecting longitudinal data. So hopefully we will have that very soon. And I mentioned I'm just starting the dietic interviews and looking at older couples and their experiences, which I'm very excited about. I think that's going to be a really, really interesting study. And I just wanted to say thank you and acknowledge some of the people I've worked with. Obviously, I'm not doing this on my own. That would be impossible. There are lots of people who do this research. I want to give a special shout out to Amy. Amy was my research assistant. She collected all the data in the Chinese community, and she lives in Beijing now. And also she gave me this beautiful scarf when she left New Zealand, and she brought this back from China, and she gave it to me, and she said, Agi, if you ever come to China to give a lecture, you can wear this beautiful scarf. So that's the reason I'm wearing the scarf that she gave me.